After a lengthy flight from South Korea, Asiana Airlines Flight 214 is nearing its final approach. At one of the busiest airports in the U.S., 307 passengers are hoping for a calm landing. There is good vision and ideal weather. However, the team will soon encounter unforeseen difficulties that will put their abilities and judgment to the test. This is the tale of Flight 214 of Asiana Airlines. Asiana Airlines Flight 214, a Boeing 777, was approaching San Francisco International Airport early on July 6, 2013. Asiana Airlines had a solid safety record up to this time, and the Boeing 777 is regarded as one of the safest and most dependable aircraft in commercial aviation. As travelers settled down for the last few minutes of their trip, the mood aboard was serene. As the aircraft started to descend, several people gazed out the windows, taking in the gorgeous scenery and clear sky. This flight was piloted by a team of 4 pilots. Despite having 9,700 flying hours, Captain Lee Kang-kook, who was in training on the trip, had just 43 hours on the Boeing 777. First Officer Lee Jong-min served as both his teacher and pilot monitor on this trip, which he was piloting. He was in charge of the approach and landing and had more than 12,000 flying hours. The crew also included a substitute first officer and a relieving captain. During the cruising phase, they seized command. Long-haul flights often use this rotating arrangement to make sure the crew gets enough sleep before the crucial approach and landing stages. Since the flight crew's internal body clocks were still set to South Korean time, it seemed like the middle of the night to them. Their attentiveness and decision-making were probably impacted since they were working during a period when their bodies would normally be at rest. Nevertheless, the aircraft was approved for a straight and visual approach to runway 28 liters at San Francisco International Airport after around 10 hours of flying. A visual approach was made possible by the favorable weather circumstances. There were minimal winds and 10 miles of visibility. San Francisco International Airport's runway 28 liters is 200 feet wide and 11,381 feet long. It is ideal for handling big aeroplanes like the Boeing 777 because of its vast reach. An instrument landing system, a precise radio navigation system, is installed at the airport to provide pilots short-range assistance when they approach a runway, particularly in bad weather or with limited visibility. The glide slope and the localizer are the 2 radio signal types that the ILS uses to function. The localizer assists the autopilot or pilots in maintaining the aircraft's alignment with the center line of the runway. It helps steer the aircraft back into the appropriate course and shows if it is too far to the right. In order to ensure that the aircraft descends to the runway at the proper slope, the glide slope aids pilots in controlling the aircraft's descent angle. It lets you know whether the aircraft is approaching too high or too low. However, the glide slope for runway 28 liters was not in use on this specific day, which made the approach more difficult. The crew had to manually regulate the airplane's descent to maintain the proper glide path, as there was no automatic guidance for their descent angle. The localizer continued to function, providing lateral assistance for the approach even if the glide slope was not accessible. The pilot on board, Captain Lee Kang-kook, had little experience flying the Boeing 777 and had never made a manual landing without the ILS's help. He has never tried a visual approach at San Francisco International Airport before. Despite his uncertainty and uneasiness about the scenario, he kept his worries to himself. This choice was probably influenced by cultural dynamics, where respect to authority is typical. He could have been reluctant to voice his doubts in front of the more seasoned instructor pilot in the hierarchical cockpit setting. 15 minutes before to landing, at 11:12 local time, the replacement first officer went back to the cockpit and sat in the jump seat behind the first officer and captain. The crew had finished the descending checklist by this time. The crew was instructed to intercept a straight-in approach on runway 28 left, and given the all-clear to descend to lower altitudes as the aeroplane proceeded towards its destination. Approach control asked the flying crew whether they could see the airport 9 minutes later. The air traffic controller gave them the all-clear for a visual approach after First Officer Lee verified that they did. The landing gear and flaps were remained up as the aircraft descended 6,300 feet at a speed around 211 knots. The flight level change speed mode, which modifies the airplane's pitch to maintain a chosen velocity during descent by raising the nose to slow down and lowering the nose to boost speed, was activated on the autopilot flight director system. The system was no longer modifying engine thrust to regulate speed since the auto throttle was in hold mode, keeping the engines running at their present setting until the pilots changed them manually. The localizer was recorded by the aircraft as it fell through 4,800 feet at 11:23. Captain Lee, the pilot, ordered the first flap to be set, and the pilot monitoring verified this. 1 pair of speed check flaps. Air traffic control told them to lower their airspeed to 180 knots and keep it there until they were 5 miles out, which was around 14 miles from the runway and dropping through 4,800 feet. The pilot asked for flaps 5 and changed the airspeed appropriately. 5 sets of speed check flaps. Although their actions were proper, it was more difficult to manage the descent since they left the autopilot in flight level change speed mode. In order to maintain the chosen airspeed, the autopilot changed the airplane's pitch. This meant that when the pilot lowered the speed, the autopilot lifted the nose to slow the aircraft. The flight crew had the option to use the speed brakes to better control the descent, but they decided against it. Things began to go awry when this choice forced the aircraft to veer above the glide path. The aircraft's departure from the proper 3-degree glide path was not immediately noticed by the pilots. Meanwhile, the pace of descent decreased to 300 feet per minute, which was far too slow to maintain the intended path. As the aircraft descended 4,300 feet and was now about 11.5 nautical miles from the runway, the pilot changed the autopilot pitch mode from flight level change speed, putting the drop rate at minus 1,000 feet per minute and switching to vertical speed mode. In vertical speed mode, the crew manually chooses the rate of descent, whereas in flight level change speed mode, the autopilot modifies the descent to maintain the chosen airspeed. In order to prevent problems with speed management, the pilots had to pay more attention to airspeed, even if this allowed them more control over the rate of fall. Simultaneously, the autothrottle transitioned from hold to SPD mode automatically. When the autothrottle switches to SPD mode, it actively controls the aircraft's airspeed by modifying engine thrust to match the chosen speed. In hold mode, the autothrottle does not modify thrust. The aircraft drifted further above the target, even though its vertical speed increased as it approached it because its 1,000 feet per minute fall rate was insufficient to maintain or recover the correct glide path. Observing from the jump seat, the relieving first officer reminded the crew that the air traffic controller had previously instructed them to maintain 180 knots until they were 5 miles from the runway. The flight crew had not to lower the airspeed to 180 knots, despite the pilot monitoring acknowledging this warning. The aircraft was now traveling too quickly, making it more difficult for the crew to efficiently control speed and altitude. The pilot ordered the landing gear to be extended at 11.24, around 8.5 nautical miles from the runway. Lowering the landing gear generated drag, which helped decrease the airplane's speed. However, even with the extra drag, the rate of fall was not enough to return to the intended glide path. Flaps 20 could have been instructed by the pilot to raise drag even more, but he chose not to. The aircraft was still about 900 feet over the intended glide path, and the flight crew was starting to feel the strain of trying to control height and velocity. The aircraft was higher than it should have been in relation to the glide route, as the pilot monitoring saw. Although he agreed, the flying pilot did not act right away. He sought explanation a few seconds later. After receiving an ambiguous answer from the first officer, the pilot decided to take action in order to correct the issue. To get the aircraft back on course, the vertical speed was adjusted to negative 1,500 feet per minute. As the aircraft dropped 2,600 feet at a pace of 1,500 feet per minute, the flying crew was unable to communicate for the following 21 seconds. However, the aircraft was still excessively high after this modification. Subsequently, the vertical speed was abruptly changed back to minus 1,000. The aircraft was still far above the intended glide path, so this change was not necessary. Regaining the proper descent route required the aircraft to fall at a speed more than 1,000 feet per minute. A lack of situational awareness of their vertical location in relation to the glide route was shown by the flight crew's inability to sustain the increased descent rate. At 11.25, the pilot monitoring confirmed the controller's directions for the flight crew to call the San Francisco Air Traffic Control Tower. Shortly later, the pilot in flight verified that 3,000 feet was the missed approach height that would be utilized in the case of a go-around. Shortly after, the aircraft descended 2,250 feet and reached the last waypoint. Diet had a minimum crossing height of 1,800 feet and was situated around 5.4 nautical miles from the runway. They were still too high for the approach, however, since the aeroplane was still around 450 feet higher than this. Reducing speed while descending was a difficulty for the pilot. It was more harder to stabilize the approach before reaching 500 feet above ground level, which is a crucial height where the aircraft has to be correctly aligned and stabilized for a safe landing, since it was too high at this time. The aircraft plummeted 1,900 feet with the flaps set to 20. The pilot asked for another flap adjustment shortly after the chosen velocity was lowered to 152 knots. 30 flaps. Flaps 30. Speed check, sir. The aircraft was still traveling faster than 170 knots, which is the greatest speed at which flap 30 can be deployed. Therefore, it was not yet possible to adjust the flaps to that position. The airplane's speed might have been further decreased by deploying flaps 30. The runway was drawing near, but the plane was still flying too high and too fast. The vertical profile of the aircraft was difficult for the pilot to control. As required by the 777 operating instructions, he changed the autopilot pitch mode once again from vertical speed to flight level change speed, without making an announcement after realizing they needed to reduce altitude faster. The pilot observing was too preoccupied with the airspeed to notice the change. He instantly reduced the flaps to 30 as the velocity fell below 170 knots. The autopilot reacted by tilting the nose up to lower the aeroplane speed when the flight level change speed option was chosen. The real airspeed stayed at 172 knots, despite the chosen speed of 152 knots. The airspeed started to decrease as the autopilot raised the pitch. At the same time, the airplane's current height of around 1,550 feet was lower than the chosen altitude of 3,000 feet, which was designated as the missed approach altitude. The autothrottle responded by advancing the thrust levers to start a climb, which caused a conflict and decreased speed by tilting up while increasing thrust to ascend. The pilot, understanding that this was not the desired result, acted immediately. Double-clicking the wheel switch, he turned off the autopilot and stopped the auditory alert from going off. He took manual control, slid the control column forward to halt the rise, and brought the thrust levers back to idle. He accidentally put the autothrottle in hold mode by manually bringing the thrust levers back to idle, which prevented the autothrottle from modifying the thrust to maintain the chosen airspeed. Now that the engines were idle, the airplane's speed started to drop down quickly. Unfortunately, the speed dropped uncontrolled since the crew was unaware that the autothrottle was off. When the pilot changed the chosen airspeed to 137 knots at 11:26, the aircraft was about 2.9 miles from the runway. The aircraft's actual airspeed at the time was still approximately 165 knots, and it was descending at a rate of about 1,000 feet per minute. The poppy lights, which would have shown 4 white lights by now, should have been visible to the pilots, indicating that the aircraft was far over the proper glide path. During visual approaches, it was customary for Asiana Airlines to switch off the flight director of the pilot flying while keeping the pilot monitorings operational. But before reactivating the pilot monitorings, the proper protocol called for shutting down both flight directors. Only the pilot's flight was disabled in this instance. The auto throttle would have returned to SPD mode, and automated airspeed control would have resumed if both had been turned off. It's possible that this omitted step helped stop the subsequent sharp decline in speed. The aircraft was still too high, as shown by the 4 whites in the poppy lights as it fell 1,000 feet at 151 speeds. We'll be back shortly. In spite of this, the aircraft was traveling at a dangerously low speed, and the rate of fall was suddenly far higher than it had to be. The aircraft remained above the glide path throughout the descent, but it abruptly started to descend quickly, making the approach much more unstable. The pilot's emphasis varied between attempting to maintain the glide route and regulating the velocity, and the crew's attention seemed split. The flight crew need to have started a go-around since the approach was not stabilized at 500 feet above the ground, which is a crucial decision height for most approaches. The pilots thought the deviations were small and could be fixed in time, but they failed to detect that the parameters exceeded the stabilized approach criterion. With 1 white light and 3 red lights showing, the PAPI lights signaled that the aircraft was falling below the glide path as its velocity started to fall below the reference speed of 132 knots. Although the pilot monitoring and relief first officer saw the low airspeed, nothing was done about it right away. Despite raising the airplane's pitch to around 4 degrees nose up, the pilot was unable to stop the fall or restore the right velocity. The plane's velocity had dropped to 122 knots as it plummeted below 200 feet, and the PAPI lights displayed 4 red lights, indicating that it was now far below the glide path. The aircraft's speed was dropping steadily, hitting 114 knots, and it was losing altitude quickly. The glide path and airspeed were now seriously mishandled, and the pilot monitoring indicated that it was low. The pilot was having trouble seeing the PAPI lights at this moment. The flight crew chose not to start a go-around in spite of these warnings and visual indicators. They could have canceled the landing attempt and gone back for another approach if they had made this crucial choice. However, recovery was already too late. The stick shaker, a warning system that sounds when the aircraft gets close to a stall, started vibrating the control column when the airplane's speed dropped to 103 knots. In an effort to boost go-around thrust, the pilot monitoring increased the thrust levels. Although the airplane's engines reacted, it was now just 39 feet above the ground, and its velocity was too low to prevent contact. The pilot attempted to start a climb by pulling back on the control column, but the aircraft was flying so low that it was no longer feasible to prevent a catastrophe. Asiana Airlines Flight 214's tail collided with the seawall near the runway's edge at 11:27. Several individuals were ejected from the aeroplane after the crash ripped off the tail portion. The main fuselage then skidded down the runway before coming to a rest in the grass as the aircraft whirled around. In the midst of the turmoil, people hurried to exit the aircraft as emergency slides were activated. The flight crew's poor control of the aircraft's speed and altitude during the last approach was the main cause of the catastrophe. An unstable approach resulted from the crew's failure to keep an eye on important flying characteristics such as airspeed and vertical profile. The pilots did not conduct a go-around in spite of many visual indications and warning indicators. The incident resulted from the aircraft colliding with the seawall immediately before the runway. Despite several severe injuries, 304 out of the 307 passengers miraculously survived the disaster. Tragically, 3 travelers perished. The crew's inexperience with visual approaches without the ILS glide slope was brought to light during an inquiry. A major factor in the tragedy was the crew's poor communication and the captain's inexperience piloting the Boeing 777. A number of safety suggestions were made after the incident, one of which was to enhance pilot training on manual flying techniques and approaches without ILS help. The incident served as a reminder of how crucial communication, situational awareness, and appropriate automation utilization are. Thanks for hanging out. If you liked this, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more awesome content. Keep the good vibes going. Check out our next video right here, or dive into more with the playlist below. See you soon.